Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us. We're going to be looking at this book, Collisions, by Michael Kimmage. It's The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability. So obviously very timely and very relevant to everything that's going on. And I think you're going to be able to give us some really good insight into the book.
Yeah, very excited to be here.
So the book basically kind of explores, like it says, the historical context behind the war in Ukraine, which began in 2022. And Kimmage really, tries to take us beyond just like, okay, this happened and this happened. He really tries to go deeper into sort of like the root causes, like why is this happening?
Yeah, and I think one of the points that Kimmage really tries to drive home is that to really grasp this war in Ukraine, we have to see it as a historical event, even while it's still ongoing.
Yeah. I mean, it's still going on, unfortunately.
Right. But we can't just look at the headlines. We have to really understand the deeper forces that are at play. Kimmage has kind of a very unique background that makes him very well positioned to really kind of break down this conflict. So he's a Cold War historian, but his expertise goes way beyond that. He's studied Russia extensively, the Soviet Union, Europe, and the U.S. And so this really broad perspective that he has allows him to connect the dots between Ukraine's history and kind of the wider global context.
So he's not just looking at, Ukraine as this isolated thing. He's saying, no, this is all connected.
Yeah, exactly. He's not just looking at Ukraine in isolation. He's showing how it's intertwined with the actions and decisions of all these other players on the world stage.
And he does that by breaking it down into these, what he calls the four major collisions.
Right. And those are really the key factors that, according to him, ultimately led to the war.
Okay. Well, let's get into it. Let's dive into the book and kind of explore those a little more.
Yeah, let's start with the preface and the introduction, because right from the beginning, you can really see how he's setting the stage for his argument. And he makes it clear that the war in Ukraine, this isn't just like a sudden eruption of conflict.
Right.
It's really rooted in this long and very complex history.
And he really emphasizes looking at it through this historical lens, if you really want to understand the causes and the implications.
Right.
And that's where he brings in Thucydides, who's
An ancient Greek historian.
Yeah, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War.
And it's such a fascinating comparison. So Kimmage draws parallels between Putin's fear of Ukraine aligning with the West and the anxieties that drove those conflicts in ancient Greece. He's basically saying that power dynamics and fear, they've always been central to how countries interact with each other, international relations, and they're playing a key role in this current crisis as well.
That's interesting. So he's saying that some patterns in the way countries relate to each other, it just kind of keeps repeating throughout history.
Right.
Even though the times and the contexts are so different.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so what are these four collisions that he argues led to the war?
Okay, so the first one is Russia's will to control Ukraine.
Okay.
The second is the precarious situation of Ukraine itself.
Okay.
The third one is the West's inconsistent policies toward Ukraine.
Sure.
And finally, the fourth one is Putin's misjudgment of U.S. capabilities.
So it's like a combination of factors, like it's not just one thing that caused the war, but these four things all kind of coming together at the same time?
Yeah, exactly. He argues that it's this confluence of these four forces colliding that ultimately led to the war.
Okay. So it's like a perfect storm.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, that's a really helpful framework. And I think that sets us up nicely to dive into chapter 1, where he really digs into that first collision, which is Russia's will to control Ukraine. And he goes way back in history. I mean, it's going back centuries, right, to kind of trace this complex relationship.
Yeah, he starts by exploring the deep ties, like the historical and cultural ties between Russia and Ukraine. And he goes way back to like the era of Kievan Ruses, which both countries kind of claim as this common ancestor. And he talks about how those shared roots have played a role in how Russia sees Ukraine. Oftentimes they see it as just an extension of Russia itself rather than its own separate independent nation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that's going to feed into Russia's, this long-held desire to control it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kimmage, he doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of this history either. He highlights all those times when Russia has exerted its dominance over Ukraine, often through military force or political coercion. Like, he looks at periods like the Soviet era where Ukraine's identity and autonomy were just suppressed under the centralized communist regime.
Wow. So it's like, I don't know, it's like a parent who can't let go of their child even when that child's grown up and wants to make their own choices.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. And it's really this dynamic of control and resistance that forms the crux of this first collision that Kimmage identifies. It's not just about those historical ties, but it's also about Russia's persistent efforts to hold on to that influence and control over Ukraine.
And of course, this is going to become even more pronounced after the Soviet era, and particularly under Putin when he comes to power.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Kimmage talks about the post-Soviet transition, explaining how the collapse of the Soviet Union left Ukraine in this very precarious position. On the one hand, they gained independence. They had this opportunity to chart their own course. But on the other hand, they faced enormous economic and political challenges. And that made them vulnerable to external pressures, especially from Russia.
Yeah, and then of course you have Putin who comes in with this, vision of restoring Russia's greatness and influence, and he's looking at Ukraine's independence as a threat to that.
Yeah. For Putin, Ukraine isn't just some neighboring country. It's like this central piece in his vision of a resurgent Russia. And he sees it as this vital part of Russia's sphere of influence, historically and culturally, and he's just not willing to let it go.
Okay, so that first collision, that's deep. It's rooted in all this history and ideology, and Putin's own personal ambitions all kind of tied up in that.
Yeah, it really sets the stage for everything that unfolds.
Yeah. It's a great, going that deep into the history. And it's really important if we're going to understand that second collision, which is the precarious situation of Ukraine itself.
Right.
So in chapter 2, he kind of turns the focus to Ukraine, and he explores those internal dynamics and the challenges that made them so vulnerable to Russian influence and interference.
Yeah. Kimmage describes a nation that's grappling with this really complex legacy of Soviet rule and, struggling to establish a stable democracy. They're trying to build a unified national identity.
Right.
And he points out that there are these deep divisions within Ukrainian society, particularly between those who identify more closely with Russia and those who want closer ties to the West.
Which, of course, is something that Russia would exploit.
Oh, absolutely. And he doesn't shy away from the internal problems that Ukraine was facing. He talks about corruption, political instability, the economic struggles they were having. And all of that really hampered their progress and made them much more susceptible to being manipulated by outside forces.
Right.
It's almost like they're caught in this geopolitical tug of war, right, between East and West, and then they've got their own internal divisions, which just adds to their vulnerability.
Right. So he's saying it's not just Russia's desire for control. It's that coupled with Ukraine's own weaknesses that make them vulnerable to that.
Exactly. And Kimmage illustrates how these internal factors created an environment where Russia could be even more effective in exerting their influence.
Yeah.
They exploited those existing divisions and used it to their advantage.
It's like divide and conquer.
You could say that. And Kimmage argues that's exactly what Putin did. He played on those divisions, fueled the separatist movements in the East, and he used propaganda and disinformation to undermine faith in the Ukrainian government and their Western partners.
Wow.
Yeah.
So these first two collisions, they're really setting the stage. You've got Russia determined to control Ukraine, and you've got Ukraine struggling to resist that control.
Right. And then we get to that third collision, which Kimmage explores in chapter 3, and it's the West's inconsistent policies toward Ukraine.
Right. So this is where the West's role in all of this comes into play. And he's pretty critical of the West's actions. He basically says that their inconsistent policies toward Ukraine contributed to the crisis.
Yeah. He specifically criticizes the U.S. and Europe for sending all these mixed signals to Ukraine, over the years. It was back and forth between these promises of support and then periods of neglect. And he argues that this inconsistency created a vacuum that Putin was very eager to exploit.
Right. So it's like they were saying one thing, we support you, we support your sovereignty, but then they weren't really backing it up. They were hesitant to provide any real security guarantees or a clear path to NATO membership.
Exactly. And that created this dangerous ambiguity that allowed Putin to think, well, maybe they won't really intervene if I decide to invade.
Wow. So he's saying that the West's actions, or maybe inaction, played a role in emboldening Putin and actually creating the conditions for this conflict.
Yeah. He's arguing that wavering commitment from the West gave Russia this opening to be more aggressive in asserting their influence.
Right. So you've got that inconsistency coupled with Russia's desire to control Ukraine, and then you've got Ukraine's own vulnerabilities.
It's a very volatile mix.
It is. It's like a recipe for disaster.
And it leads us right into that fourth collision, which Kimmage explores in Chapter 4, and that's Putin's misjudgment of U.S. capabilities.
Right. So here he's really kind of getting into Putin's head. He's looking at Putin's psychology and decision-making. Despite his intelligence background and his years of experience, he just fundamentally misjudged the situation.
Yeah. Kimmage argues that Putin totally underestimated the West's resolve to support Ukraine. He points to several factors that may have contributed to this miscalculation, like the chaotic withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan. And also this perception that America was divided and distracted and looking inward.
So he saw that as a sign of weakness. He thought, okay, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to stand up to me.
Exactly. Kimmage suggests that Putin basically saw what he wanted to see, filtering information to fit his worldview and ignoring anything that contradicted his assumptions.
It's interesting how he weaves all these collisions together, how they all came together to create this perfect storm that led to the war.
It's a very powerful narrative.
It is, and it lays the foundation for him to explore these different presidential eras in the following chapters.
Right.
And that's where we will pick things up next. Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. Welcome back to our deep dive into Michael Kimmage's collisions. We left off talking about the 4 major collisions that he says led to the war in Ukraine. You know, Russia's will to control, Ukraine's internal vulnerabilities, the West's inconsistent policies, and then Putin just misjudging the U.S., misjudging what they would do.
Right. And in the next few chapters, we really see those collisions in action as Kimmage takes us through different U.S. presidential eras, starting with Obama.
So let's go to Chapter 5, the Obama years. How did his whole foreign policy approach, which Kimmage describes as idealistic and committed to, this liberal international order, how did that play into this whole unfolding drama with Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, Kimmage portrays Obama as someone who really believed in the power of diplomacy and working with other countries, that multilateralism. He came into office hoping for a more cooperative relationship with Russia. In fact, he actually attempted a reset early on.
The reset, right?
Yeah, which was really an effort to find common ground on some of the big issues like arms control and nuclear non-proliferation.
So Obama comes in wanting to hit the refresh button, have a more collaborative relationship with Russia. But how does that fit in with Kimmage's argument about the West's inconsistency? Because he says that's a major contributing factor to the conflict, right?
That's a really good question. And Kimmage does acknowledge that the reset did lead to some progress, at least initially, especially when Medvedev was president. But he argues that it also created this false sense of optimism, kind of masking the deeper problems, those tensions and disagreements that were already simmering beneath the surface.
So it's like a temporary fix,
Yeah.
but not really addressing the underlying issues.
Yeah, exactly. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. It might look better on the surface, but the problem's still there. And of course, this becomes even more obvious when Putin returns to power in 2012, because that really marked a clear shift back to a more assertive and confrontational stance from Russia toward the West.
So the reset doesn't really change those underlying dynamics in the U.S.-Russia relationship.
Right. It's like this mismatch of expectations. You have Obama hoping for cooperation, and then you have Putin coming in with his much more assertive agenda.
Right.
And that really creates fertile ground for misunderstanding and mistrust.
So we see this clash of worldviews, even during this period of so-called reset. Are there any specific events during Obama's presidency that kind of highlight that tension?
Yeah, Kimmage points to a number of these flashpoints. A good example is the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia over those breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
Right. That was a real wake-up call for a lot of people. It definitely sent shockwaves through the international community. I mean, it showed that Russia was willing to use military force, to assert its dominance in the region.
Yeah, it was a clear demonstration of their willingness to use force. And Kimmage argues that the West's response at the time, while they did condemn it, it wasn't enough to really deter Russia. And it might have even given Putin the impression that they were weak and wouldn't stand up to him.
So this is like the seeds of the conflict in Ukraine being sown, even before 2014.
Yeah, Kimmage is suggesting that the war in Georgia should have been a wake-up call for the West, a clear sign of what Putin was willing to do to achieve his goals.
Like a warning shot that no one really paid attention to?
And it wasn't the last one, unfortunately.
Right. So then you have the Arab Spring and the intervention in Libya. He talks about that in Chapter 6.
Mm-hmm.
How did those events complicate the relationship between the U.S. and Russia?
The Arab Spring uprisings, with all these calls for democracy, it created both opportunities and challenges for Obama. The U.S. was initially supportive of these movements, trying to promote peaceful transitions to democracy. It was a bit of a different approach than the Bush era, which was much more focused on regime change.
Right. A little bit more nuanced, maybe.
Yeah.
But then things took a turn with Libya, right?
Right. The situation in Libya escalated very quickly, with Gaddafi cracking down hard on the protesters,
Yeah.
and it became a humanitarian crisis. And so the international community, led by the U.S., they had to figure out how to respond.
What was Russia's take on all this? Were they on the same page as the West?
Not really. They were very suspicious of the whole Western intervention in Libya. They saw it as a violation of Libya's sovereignty, another example of the West meddling in other countries' affairs.
Right.
They used the humanitarian intervention as an excuse. So you see this clash of worldviews again. And Kimmage argues that this clash over Libya would have a lasting impact. It really deepened the rift between the U.S. and Russia.
So it damaged trust even further.
Yeah, exactly. Russia was already wary of the West, and then this whole Libya situation just confirmed their fears. They said, see, we told you so. This intervention is just going to destabilize the region, lead to chaos, not democracy.
So it made it even harder to find any kind of common ground on other issues, like Ukraine.
Exactly. Kimmage suggests that Libya cast a long shadow over U.S.-Russia relations, making it really difficult to cooperate on anything.
Okay, so we've talked about Libya. Let's circle back to Ukraine. Kimmage spends a good chunk of time in chapters 7 and 8 really dissecting Obama's approach to Ukraine. How did those policies contribute to the tensions that eventually led to the 2014 crisis?
So Kimmage argues that while the Obama administration was supportive of Ukraine's independence, they were also really cautious about provoking Russia or escalating tensions. So their policy was kind of a balancing act.
Right, so we're back to that tightrope that the West seems to always be walking between, like supporting Ukraine and then trying to appease Russia.
Exactly. And Kimmage is quite critical of this. He argues that in the end, it just emboldened Putin and made the crisis more likely.
So how did that happen?
Well, he says that the U.S., while they were saying they supported Ukraine joining the West, they weren't willing to offer any real security guarantees or a clear path to becoming a member of NATO.
So it was more talk than action.
Yeah. Lots of mixed signals instead of, a strong unified message of support. And that ambiguity, that's what Putin exploited.
It sounds like there's a lot of miscommunication and misinterpretation going on.
Yeah, both sides are reading into each other's actions through this lens of suspicion and fear.
Right, which is exactly the kind of dynamic that Kimmage is warning us about. So then we get to 2014, which really shook things up between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. What happened? What was it that led to the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine?
So in 2014, Ukraine was at this crossroads. You had these protests erupting all over the country because people were frustrated with their president, Yanukovych, because he rejected this agreement with the European Union.
Right.
She decided to move closer to Russia instead.
So it was a choice for Ukraine West or Russia?
Exactly. And those protests you probably remember, they were called the Euromaidan Revolution. And they escalated quickly into a full-blown revolution, forcing Yanukovych to flee.
Wow. It must have been an incredibly tense and chaotic time for Ukraine.
It was. And for Russia, it was a huge warning sign. Like, Ukraine was slipping away.
Right.
And so under Putin, Russia reacted very quickly and decisively because they saw the revolution as a direct threat to their interests.
So what did they do?
In February 2014, Russian troops, they didn't even have any insignia on their uniforms, but they just took control of all these strategic locations in Crimea. Right.
Which is that peninsula on the Black Sea with a large Russian-speaking population. And then they held this very rushed referendum, and boom, Crimea was annexed by Russia.
Wow, a blatant land grab. I mean, the whole world saw it as a violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty.
Yeah, he was condemned across the board, but unfortunately didn't end there. After Crimea, you had these pro-Russian separatists, backed by Russia, launching an insurgency in eastern Ukraine. They took control of some key cities in the Donbas region.
So it became a full-blown war, with Russia fueling the conflict, but never really admitting to it.
Yeah, it was a proxy war. They were providing the weapons, the training, and the logistical support, but they kept denying any direct involvement.
So how did the West respond?
They imposed sanctions, targeting people and businesses close to Putin, but there was no military intervention.
So, again, kind of a hesitant response. maybe because of that same cautious approach that Kimmage keeps criticizing. And he argues that this hesitant response just reinforced Putin's belief that the West wouldn't stand up to him, that they were too weak and divided. So the 2014 crisis, it was a major turning point. It really escalated tensions between Russia and the West, and it showed how much the West was struggling to come up with an effective strategy for dealing with Putin.
Yeah, a lot of miscalculations and missed opportunities, it seems.
Yeah, it was. It was a preview of the much larger conflict that was to come. And then we get to the end of Obama's presidency.
Right.
And things are about to get even more volatile and uncertain with the start of the Trump era.
Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. These are crucial years if we really want to understand what led up to the 2022 invasion.
That's exactly right. Kimmage spends chapters 9 and 10 looking at how the Trump presidency really shook up U.S. foreign policy. It was a pretty dramatic departure from how things were normally done.
I mean, Trump was known for doing things his own way, right? So how did that whole approach, his style, his admiration for strongmen like Putin, and his disregard for traditional alliances, how did all that affect the relationship with Russia, which was, I mean, already pretty strained, right?
Kimmage argues that it really threw things into a state of chaos, Trump's unpredictable behavior, his praising of Putin, and then his willingness to go against U.S. allies, it created this environment of uncertainty. It's like nobody really knew what to expect.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because from what we've been talking about, it seems like consistency and clarity are really important when you're dealing with Russia. And Trump was, well, definitely not known for those things.
Exactly. Kimmage points out how Trump would praise Putin one minute and then slap sanctions on them the next. It was like whiplash. Russia, and probably everyone else, had no idea what his real intentions were.
It's like he was playing some high-stakes poker game with Putin, always bluffing, never showing his cards.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And you know what? Kimmage thinks that this whole unpredictability thing, while it might have been meant to keep Putin guessing, it actually backfired.
How so?
Well, it basically created this space, this void where misunderstandings and miscalculations could happen. Putin, who's a very strategic thinker, was trying to figure out Trump's moves, but was probably viewing them through his own lens of suspicion.
So it just made the distrust that was already there even worse.
Exactly, and it made it harder for the West to present a united front against Russia.
Right, right. Okay, well, we can't talk about Trump without talking about the elephant in the room, which is, of course, the allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election. How did that scandal add to the already messy relationship between Trump and Putin?
Yeah, that's a big one. Kimmage really gets into this in Chapter 10. He argues that those allegations, and then Trump's denials, cast a huge shadow over his whole presidency. It created a firestorm here in the U.S. People were suspicious about collusion between Trump's campaign and Russia, and it just eroded trust even further between Washington and Moscow.
So it basically poisoned the well, made it almost impossible for them to have any kind of real conversation.
Pretty much. And it also made people question whether Trump was really willing to stand up to Putin.
Okay, and then there's that whole thing with Trump and NATO. Kimmage also talks about how Trump was undermining U.S. alliances, especially with NATO.
Yeah, that was a big deal. Trump kept saying that NATO was obsolete, a financial burden on the U.S., and that really worried our European allies. They started to wonder if the U.S. was still committed to protecting them.
Which is exactly what Putin wanted to hear.
Right. I mean, NATO was created to counter the Soviet Union and then Russia, and here's Trump weakening it from within.
So it played right into Putin's hands.
Yeah, it did. By questioning NATO and being so friendly with Putin, Trump basically made Russia stronger and the West weaker.
Okay, so then we come to the Biden era, Chapter 11. Biden comes in with a very different approach to Russia. How did his efforts to restore U.S. credibility and kind of rebuild relationships, how did that play into things?
Well, Biden was determined to reassert U.S. leadership, to rebuild those alliances that had been frayed, and to directly confront Russia's aggressive actions.
So it was back to a more traditional foreign policy, kind of like hitting the reset button again.
Yeah, you could say that. And Kimmage points out that this was more predictable, more aligned with what the U.S. has always stood for, but it wasn't easy.
What do you mean?
Well, Biden inherited this relationship that was already in really bad shape. Years of tensions, disagreements, and scandals made it very hard to build trust or find common ground.
So even though the leadership changed and the approach changed, the underlying problems were still there.
Exactly. And while Biden was trying to set some clear boundaries, to prevent things from getting totally out of control, the big disagreements, like over Ukraine, NATO expansion, and democracy, those were all still there.
And that's ultimately what led to the invasion in 2022, right?
Right. Even with Biden's efforts to deter Russia, Putin miscalculated. He thought the U.S. was weak and wouldn't intervene to protect Ukraine.
And that was a tragic mistake.
It was.
So, as we wrap up our look at collisions, it's clear that Kimmage presents a really sobering account of what led to this war. He sees it as something that could have been avoided, a tragedy born out of miscalculations, missed opportunities, and a failure to truly see things from the other side's point of view.
Yeah, and he leaves us with this sense of just how complex international relations are, and how important it is to have clear communication, strong alliances, and the courage to stand up for what's right.
It's been a fascinating journey through history and geopolitics, and though our review is coming to an end, history will show us how the future of Ukraine unfolds. You need to read this book.
Yeah.
It's insightful, thought-provoking, and a real wake-up call.
Couldn't agree more. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the world we live in. And remember, the more we know, the better equipped we are to have those tough conversations and to work toward a more peaceful future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.